So on this channel I've already analysed how the character of Ebenezer Scrooge is presented in Staves 1 and 2 of Charles Dickens's novella A Christmas Carol. Now I guess the question is, how is he presented in Stave 3? Let's find out. How's it going, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video we are going to think about the character Ebenezer Scrooge and how he is presented in Stave 3 of A Christmas Carol. Now, you might ask yourself why I'm analysing Scrooge on a stave by stave basis, which, you know what, is a fair enough question to ask. Simply put, I think Scrooge is far too complex a character to analyse in one short video. I want to provide you all with detailed revision notes and ideas so that we can think about his complexities and subtle changes, which should help you to achieve the top grades. The alternative, of course, would be a very quick, surface level analysis of Scrooge, which, to be honest, I don't think is particularly useful at all. Definitely not for those of you looking to get a grade 7 or higher. As per usual, I strongly recommend that you make sure you've got a pen and some paper to hand so that you may make notes of the things that I discuss over the course of this video. And of course, if you do find this to be helpful, please do consider showing your support by liking, commenting, subscribing and sharing. All of that lovely stuff. And yes, I know that generic YouTuber beg is pretty cringeworthy, but genuinely, your support really does help me out so much more than you know. It's always worth having a quick think about who Scrooge is. There are different approaches you can take whilst doing this. You can think of him as a character, so, a made-up person. You can think of his role within the story, or you can think of him as a symbol, metaphor, or representation of someone or something else. Now, the ideas that are on screen at the moment are ideas that I've already explained in some detail in my analysis of Scrooge in Stave 1. Rather than repeat myself over and over and over and over and over again, I recommend that you check that video out after you've watched this one, if you haven't already done so. Now, I know you're probably watching this video because you're after some quotations, right? Well, get ready, because here they come. Before we get started, I just want to give you a quick reminder that all the page numbers I reference are for this copy of the book. And so the page numbers might be different if you're using a different edition of the story. Although I'm hoping I still make it pretty clear whereabouts in the stave each quotation comes from. Anyway, the first quotation I want us to think about comes shortly after Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Present meet and before they leave Scrooge's house. When the spirit suggests that he has more than 1,800 brothers, Scrooge retorts with, "A tremendous family to provide for." I think this quotation is interesting, as it shows us that as much as Scrooge has started to change in the previous two staves, his transformation is far from complete. The word that reveals this to me is the verb provide, as it shows that Scrooge's worldview is still financially driven because he sees a large family as a cost, an expenditure, something to pay for, rather than seeing it as a source of great love and comfort and support. This could suggest that as much as Scrooge found revisiting his past to be quite distressful, and as much as it prompted him to begin to reconsider his ways, he hasn't quite learned his lesson just yet. Now, for this specific idea, I don't actually think there's much in the way of extra quotations in Stave 3, and that's precisely because Scrooge's attitude changes so drastically in this part of the story. Scrooge observes the spirit sprinkling a substance from his torch onto the food of passers-by. Scrooge inquires about this sprinkling, and the spirit announces that it gives this to a poor meal most. To which Scrooge replies, "Why to a poor one most?" It is Scrooge's question, Why to a poor one most? That interests me. Encoded within this question is Scrooge's ignorance. In asking why it is that the poor need the spirit's incense the most, a substance that I kind of see as a literalisation for Christmas cheer, it becomes clear that Scrooge is unaware of just how difficult life is for the poor. He doesn't see why they might need extra cheer or support at Christmas time, and why they might need it more than people who are more well off. Perhaps Scrooge's lack of sympathy towards the poor in Stave 1 is in fact just because he doesn't actually understand them. He just sees them as financial drains rather than people. Again, I'm not providing any extra quotations for this idea, as I think this question shows Scrooge's ignorance pretty clearly, and his ignorance is soon to be dispelled in the Stave, as he will see the Cratchit household in just a little bit. So our next quotation can be found when Scrooge and the spirit discuss Tiny Tim, the weak and feeble Cratchit child. If he be like to die, he'd better do it and decrease the surplus population, says the spirit of Christmas Present. To which Scrooge hangs his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. Now, I hope you recognise the spirit's words, because they echo Scrooge's statement from Stave 1 when he was in dialogue with the charity representatives. The fact that the spirit says these words is interesting for sure, but this video is about Scrooge, so why am I mentioning this? Well, the reason why is because I think Scrooge's reaction is worth analysing. Upon hearing his words being used against him, Scrooge hangs his head, a clear act of shame, and he is overcome with penitence and grief. Penitence is a noun that means showing sorrow or regret for something you have done, and grief, well, it means a similar thing really, but it's usually associated with someone's death. What is clear, I think, is that Scrooge is suddenly ashamed by his earlier thoughts and actions, perhaps because the people he had previously described as the surplus population have now been humanised for him. If he is so ashamed to have previously been so unsympathetic towards the poor, you might even argue that seeing the Cratchit family has triggered Scrooge to hold a more sympathetic attitude towards those less fortunate than himself. This idea is evident elsewhere in Stave 3. Most obviously is just a moment before the previous quotation, because Scrooge would only ask about Tiny Tim's life if he cared about it to an extent. The embedded clause, with an interest he had never felt before, demonstrates to us that this care is a recent development for Scrooge. And what about Scrooge's question at the end of the Stave? In reference to ignorance and want, Scrooge asks the spirit, "Have they no refuge or resource?" This quotation pairs really well with his question in Stave 1, "Are there no prisons?" as they show totally contrasting viewpoints. Scrooge wants to support the poor now, rather than punish them. I also think that it's interesting that he shows this sympathy to ignorance and want, who are not really people, but otherworldly beings who represent the poor en masse. Scrooge's sympathies then do not only apply to the poor people that he knows, but are beginning to extend towards all poor people. It's always worth considering what characters say about each other, as it provides an alternative angle for us to consider how characters are presented. So when the spirit turns nasty, it suggests that it may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Now, I don't know about you, but the adjective worthless and phrase less fit to live really stand out to me here. Despite his immense wealth, Scrooge is deemed to have no value to God, probably because he made other people's lives more miserable, despite the fact that he had the capacity to make them immensely better. Certainly, it seems that Scrooge is not thought of particularly highly, at least in the eyes of the ghost of Christmas Present. However, the negative view of Scrooge is seen elsewhere in Stave 3. For instance, it is evident in the quotation, "Scrooge was the ogre of the family." Now this is quite an interesting quotation, right? Because it doesn't mean that Scrooge is like Shrek. Instead, it is comparing Scrooge to a folkloric, rather than biblical, devil, a creature of immense evil, darkness and power, but one that is also presented as being somewhat stupid and therefore beatable. That could mean then that the Cratchits, or at least certainly Mrs. Cratchit, dislike Scrooge but do not fear him, and that his stupidity might be seen in the way in which he hoards money rather than putting it to good use. There are many words you could use to describe Scrooge based on this quotation. I would probably be inclined to say that it shows him to be monstrous. Furthermore, Fred calls Scrooge a comical old fellow, suggesting that he does not take his uncle particularly seriously. Is Scrooge then just a bit of a joke? Irrespective of which of these three quotations you decide to go with, it's clear that Scrooge is not viewed particularly positively. And what does he have to blame for this? Himself and his actions. For our final quotation for Stave 3, I thought it would be good to look at how Scrooge behaves as he observes Fred's Christmas celebrations. Dickens writes, "They all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears, he sometimes came out of his guess quite loud." Now what's fascinating here is that Scrooge is actually having fun, as evidenced by the fact that he plays along with the party guests, forgets that they can't hear him, and shouts his answers out loudly. Without knowing it, Scrooge is embracing human company and lowering his barriers, opening up that oyster shell that he has kept closed for so long. I think it's important to consider that Scrooge actually is capable of enjoying himself, as it makes him less of a one-dimensional character, whereas it is also important to consider that this only happens once he begins to show care towards the less fortunate. Is Dickens then suggesting that being sympathetic towards others is the key to happiness? Now, I've got no extra quotations for this idea, primarily because Scrooge's happiness is only depicted quite late on in Stave 3. You could argue that this is a small or minor moment, and I would not necessarily disagree with you, but it's by analysing those small moments and subtle changes that you are going to secure those top grades. Righty then, so that is us almost over. Just a quick summary and then an optional task for you to tackle, so please don't close the video just yet. Now, if I were going to summarise Scrooge in Stave 3, I might say something like, Stave 3 presents the most profound change to Scrooge's character. To start, his persistent greed clouds his worldview, and he is shown to be ignorant about the plight of the lower classes. However, after seeing the Cratchit family, especially Tiny Tim, he becomes more sympathetic towards the poor. And although it is apparent that people in the present have poor opinions of him, it seems that his heart is starting to warm towards others. As I've said before, I always think it's useful to have a summary written down somewhere. It will help to jog your memory when you get round to revising, could act as a good introduction to an essay, and it might also prompt several paragraphs if you think about those key words. So thinking about Scrooge's greedy worldview, thinking about how he might be ignorant, how he becomes more sympathetic, how people don't particularly like him, how he's maybe detested, and also then how his heart is starting to warm towards others. Anyway, I said there was going to be something for you, so here is a quick question for you. Which opinion about Scrooge, the spirit's assertion that he might be worthless, that he is an ogre to the Cratchits, or Fred's belief that he is a comical old fool to be laughed at, do you think describes him the most accurately, and why? Do whatever you want with that question, even if it just means ignoring it, although that obviously means you won't get the most out of watching this video. You could create a mind map that goes through each opinion of him. You could use it as a discussion question if you're revising with your friends, and you could definitely use it to write a mini essay down in the comment section. Genuinely, I absolutely love seeing your ideas, and I think it is always interesting to see what your opinions are. So why not pause the video and give it a go? I'm usually pretty good at responding to comments too, so you'll even get some feedback from me. Okay, so that is my analysis of Scrooge in Stave 3 of A Christmas Carol complete. I really do hope that this video has helped you out, whether that's because you are revising for exams, studying A Christmas Carol for the first time, or you just have a passing interest in Charles Dickens's writing. If you have found this video to be interesting or useful, I'm sure you know how you can make your appreciation known. As ever, I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. And if you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks. As a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be. So if I were to sum up Scrooge's presentation in Stave 3 of A Christmas Carol, I would say that he is changing. Now the reason why I say this is because he is starting to show more sympathy towards those less fortunate than him, especially Tiny Tim, but also he's actually shown that he can enjoy Christmas. Something that I don't think he's done for a very long time at all.